Organizations' internal networks are overly permissive and can't distinguish trusted from untrusted applications. Attackers abuse this condition to move laterally through networks, bypassing address-based controls to spread malware. Edgewise abstracts security policies away from traditional network controls that rely on IP addresses, ports, and protocols, and instead ties controls directly to applications. Edgewise allows organizations to analyze the network attack surface and segment workloads based on the software and how it's communicating. Edgewise monitors applications and protects data paths using zero trust segmentation. Visit edgewise.net/Security Weekly to get your free month of visibility. Some restrictions apply. Are you an enterprise dissatisfied with overpriced analytics software that can't keep up with modern data? If so, then GravWell is the solution for you. GravWell is an unstructured data analytics platform for enterprises who demand total data visibility across their network. GravWell lets your security team go beyond the SIM and fuse data sources to correlate and answer questions you didn't know needed to be asked. Go to gravwell.io/Security Weekly for an unlimited data trial and gain uncompromising visibility today. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs, their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunt to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. A quick announcement. Some of you have told us that you are overwhelmed by the amount of content that we distribute. In an attempt to make it a little easier for you to find what you're interested in, we've created a listener interest list, because I can't say interest apparently. Sign up for the list and select your interest by visiting securityweekly.com/subscribe and click the interests button. Or some button, and just go to securityweekly.com/subscribe. And you can go to securityweekly.com/booking to do all kinds of stuff. You can request a briefing, you can request a Black Hat or Hacker Halted interview, you can suggest a guest on the show, and do all kinds of stuff at securityweekly.com/booking. And now Josh Abraham, a.k.a. Jabra, is back on the show, and he was on a show yesterday because we can't get enough Jabra for the week, apparently. Josh, welcome to Paul's Security Weekly.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yes, nice to have you, my friend. And I'm excited to talk about, well, a couple things. The Mitre Attack framework. Josh and his company Praetorian have also released an open sourced Metasploit inside of a Docker image to do all kinds of purple teaming stuff. And there are new updates to the Mitre Attack framework, and we're going to talk about that in the context of an attacker, as yesterday we talked about in the context of a defender on Enterprise Security Weekly. So, yeah.
Yes. So there's a whole lot to discuss, and yeah, there's plenty to talk about. So maybe we should just dive in.
Let's do it.
Excellent. So the first thing that we basically been working on was, as you'd said, a Metasploit version to basically focus on Purple Team and Mitre Attack automation to make this a little bit easier. And so what was released today was our 1.0 release, and then we actually put together a video demonstration of this, and so that's one thing that we can cover. And then additionally, I actually released a tool and a blog post today specifically around process injection to basically make that a little bit easier for testing.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's wicked cool. Well. Are you going to talk? All right. I'm excited about everything, so carry on.
Is that what that smell is?
Yes.
What was the question?
I like the process injection. Maybe we can start there, because I think that's really cool.
Oh, he loves
process
anything with
injection is absolutely one of my favorite parts. And so before I dive into a demo, I'll set the stage initially. And so when you're doing a Purple Team style injection of testing injection, what you really need to be looking at is using a benign payload. So a payload that is not necessarily malicious, or not necessarily like a traditional, like Meterpreter or like a Cobalt Strike or any sort of actual CT payload. And so we're trying to do is use a benign payload.
Why is that? Because actual payloads are more fun than fake payloads, Josh.
100%. And so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to test the behavior of the endpoint EDR products.
Not the signature. If I used real payloads, it may trip a signature, but that's not really why it found me. I want it to find me with a benign payload and detect the method.
100%. And so if they're detecting the payload, that's great, but we need to make sure that they're detecting the behavior as well.
It's awesome.
And so detecting the payload isn't enough. And so when we do a purple team style test, we want to use a benign payload that validates and proves, did they actually detect the behavior, or was it a interpreter, which is not necessarily what's going to be used by a real adversary. So like China or Russia, if they're breaking into an organization, they're probably not going to be using the traditional pen tester or red team style tools. Or maybe they are, but
I was going to say, yeah, in some cases, maybe they are. Maybe with slight modification. And then, you're right. There are groups that are probably rolling all their own stuff to evade detection because it's that important to them.
Exactly. The NSA is going to be rolling their own stuff. We saw with the releases and such.
Well,
a lot of these groups are rolling their own.
And Josh, to that point, if you're trying to be stealthy, it's likely because you have a specific target in mind, and therefore you have to be stealthy. In the attackers that are like monetizing, not looking to spy or do damage or have some specific purpose, the monetization of the attackers, they just need to get into a whole bunch of organizations. So if it fails in 25%, and even if they get caught in 25%, as long as they roll their C2 channels, they're good, right?
Yeah, it depends on some of the motivations and desired outcomes. So if you're doing like a disinformation campaign, or you're trying to look like your stuff looks like this particular payload, then that all can happen. But regardless of all of that, the behaviors at the end of the day, that's what the detection tools need to actually capture and also flag. And so one of the tools I put together was a tool for testing injection to make it super easy. And so looked at the landscape for what was available. And there was a number of tools that actually did some coverage for detection, testing injection based methods, but we weren't happy with what they did in terms of the comprehensiveness of their coverage. And also one of the elements that we like to use is shellcode for doing our injections, because then we can change the shellcode and do whatever we like at that from that perspective. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my screen, and we can jump into some live demos.
That's awesome.
Excellent. So can you see my screen all right? How's the text on this?
Do we need to make the text a little bigger maybe? I would say crank it up one notch.
Go ahead and do that.
The nice part is if we go off my eyes, it'll be big enough for most.
So many jokes, so little time.
Right? And I even have glasses on that have like a 1x magnification. Yeah, it's beautiful.
How was that for you?
I was just like running back to the microphone to delete. But anyway.
How was that for
beautiful?
Beautiful.
It's beautiful.
Excellent. So the tool I created is called Vulcan, and it basically handles all of your injection style testing needs. So compiled this with Visual Studio, and we have a README on the GitHub page, and obviously we'll be including notes in the show notes. But just running it straight up on the command line, I actually included the usage step, so that if you've never run the tool, if you need to get started, you have examples to just copy and paste, because copy and pasting is absolutely the best way to do what you're doing. So that's just a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, and I love that we've been nerding out on keyboards lately and finding the perfect keyboard. In everything that we do, we try to type less, even though we have the world's most fantastic hand assembled, even in some cases, keyboards, right?
Yes. Speaking of which, later.
Anyway.
Later.
Totally want a neural interface. I can't wait till we get it.
Yeah. So there's no voice activated interface for this at this time, but we'll work on that as a potential future request in the future. So starting out, we're going to just spawn Notepad, because I love injecting into Notepad, because why not? And then just a quick example, everybody's favorite, create remote thread, right? So just a simple example. And we've actually included sample shellcode inside of the utility for doing things like spawning the calculator, spawning the message box. Pretty simple examples, and you can obviously go into the source code, modify that shellcode to have whatever you want. Or
and Josh, what I love is that you're running regular executables, but via some type of process injection. And
correct.
So it's totally all about the method in which you can invoke code, and not about the code that you can execute. It's brilliant.
100%. And so we can do like a message box, which is one of the most benign, or you can do the calculator, which is everybody's favorite POC for getting execution.
Right.
So depending on what you want to do, again, these are controllable at runtime. So if you want to take base64 based shellcode, put it in a file, you want to run it, go ahead. Like, not a problem. This totally supports that.
Gotcha. So you can put any type of payload you want in there.
Yeah, and so a calculator, spawning the calculator, that's cool. Message box, that's pretty benign. That works. Or if you have some exotic payload that you want to try, throw it in there and make that work as well. We're just going to go off and use the calculator because it's the most simple example, and so that just spawns our calculator, and there we go. And we saw that Notepad actually gets killed because that's the way that shellcode is actually designed. It's gonna stop that process, and so it handles that. And so that's an intentional component of that shellcode that I passed in. But if I go down the list and I can just copy and paste these examples, you'll see the DLL injection, all of these different methods, and then our shellcode methods that are also supported, and then some of these others which are I guess a little bit less common in terms of some of the tools. And so we wanted to try to make it easier for people that are doing a purple team style detection assessment of these different EDR products and looking at injection, because it's such a big TTP. If you look at it and you think about it, there's so many different ways that you could do it. What are these tools, these EDR products? What do they actually do? What do they detect and what do they not detect? And at the end of the day, the value to the offense from doing a purple team style test is that's going to inform your red team to be able to make decisions faster.
Now, Josh, are any of these methods that you list there, are they used by completely legitimate software? And is it just a very low frequency at which they're used, or are they pretty much like never used in legitimate software?
So that's going to depend on the function. So some of these very common, some of these less so common. That's going to depend, and that's specific to the different techniques. I will say that all the techniques that we included are already public.
Gotcha.
There's nothing that is like considered like a new 0-day vulnerability in any of this. We're just trying to make it that much easier for anybody who wants to do injection tests. Make it fast, make it easy, make it quick, and get you the data that you're looking for faster.
And Josh, this is only supported on Windows today. Do you have plans to do Linux or Mac OS?
So at this time, this is a strictly Windows only based tool. You could do a version for Linux or Mac, but the way that this was built was not with that in mind.
Gotcha.
So these are very Windows specific in terms of the techniques and the process.
And this is open source?
That's correct. Yeah. So if you go to if you go to our blog, which is Praetorian.com, and if you click on the blog, you'll see a blog post that I did where I basically did a write-up of this utility, why it's useful, how it works, and a quick example of how to get started and start using it.
That's awesome. And for those that want to contribute, you could start modeling a Linux in a Mac OS, start coding that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you wanted to look at the blog post, I have it up here. I don't know if you guys can see my screen. Let me switch the screen share. Switch my screen share. So this is just on our blog, and we have the code, which is on the Praetorian GitHub page. It's Praetorian -code, and then Vulkan is the name of the utility.
Is that because it's very
compiling it in Visual Studio?
Is that because it's very logical? Is that the name Vulkan?
I was just
live long and prosper.
Naming stuff is hard, and so that was the name that I thought of at the time.
Appreciate your honesty. I like it. I was expecting some big long story there, but
no, naming stuff is actually really hard.
I agree.
When you go in and you build a utility, I've always felt like I'll name the stuff, last. I build the tool and whatnot, and then coming back to the name. This one just sort of, it was on the tip of my tongue, and I just sort of we'll just go with that. Star Wars, maybe. Well, there's some references there, but yeah, no, it includes all the utilities, and so the build process is fairly straightforward. Fire up Visual Studio, and then just do the compile, and then you're off to the races with running it. I will say that right now we're recommending that you use a 32-bit process for doing your injection if you're using 32-bit DLLs or shellcode. So the cross architecture isn't something that I fully tested,
Mhm.
but I did test this on Windows 10, x86, and x64. So go to town on it, and I'm sure you'll see good results. Shouldn't be any issues. And then if you wanted to change out the shellcode, there are steps on how you would do that. So this is just a basic example that I used from MSF Venom with Metasploit. And so including the benign calculator execution or the message box shellcode, fairly easy to do. And then you can just base64 encode it. And then there you go. You're off to the races.
Sweet.
So that is the majority of the Vulkan side. Are there any other techniques or pieces of this that you guys want to see that would be interesting for you guys?
Larry, Joff, Lee, questions for Josh on this great utility?
What did he say for the last 10 minutes?
What if
Sorry.
No.
Keep your head in the game, Joff.
That's terrible.
Joff is
I'm
pretty
sorry.
old. He probably dozed off for a little while.
Yeah. What did he say? Huh?
Yeah.
Hold on.
It's past my nap time.
I will throw this over to Larry.
No, I specifically don't have any questions, but I can absolutely see the value in.
I don't think you do a lot of. You're mostly red teaming rather than purple teaming today.
We do some purple teaming, not nearly as much as some of the red teaming stuff, but having that utility,
Yeah,
as it were,
exactly.
to be able to emulate all the stuff that we do that folks should be able to monitor and catch.
You know what I call purple teaming?
Yeah.
I call purple teaming red teaming, changing to purple about midway through.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
Joff's right. That's oftentimes how it happens.
That's exactly how we
red team. Shit, we're on. How'd you do that?
Yeah, like we're on
Yeah.
the first day about 3, 4, 6 different ways. Maybe we should just go to a purple team and that would be more effective, right? It's kind of how I envision it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a negotiation, but that tends to happen a lot. Now, starting out purple in the beginning, yeah, we do that. We just call it something different.
Yeah.
But,
Now, Josh, it sounds like you're doing a lot more of what Joff was talking about, starting off on the purple teaming side.
So the way that we sort of do it is, we'll work with clients on a recurring basis to do purple team style tests, and we'll basically do recurring purple teams.
Yep.
And the idea usually is to get them ready for a red team style test. If they're not
Sure.
ready for it, they likely already know that, and therefore, if you go in with a red team test and you do all the things and you achieve all of the objectives, but they didn't have much in terms of detection, then the question is, what was the value really? If they know that beforehand, then it's much more valuable to say, let's start with doing, make sure that your detection controls are up to speed, sufficient, and then get you to a place where we feel like you're ready for a red team. Because not setting the customer up for success is just a disservice, right?
It segues into what we were talking about yesterday on Enterprise Security Weekly, in the context of what I said to others on the show, right? What I said was that there are some fairly still today significant gaps in what we see as, I'll call them exposures, to not be specific to vulnerability or exploit or whatever, right? But exposures that we've identified as senior security people, security researchers, pen testers. There's gaps between what we see as the ways that attackers are being successful and what defenders are aware of in terms of the ways in which the methods and techniques, or TTPs, that attackers are using today. And I think the Mitre Attack framework is critical to bridging that gap between us collectively, like hosts on the show, going, no one's really like fixing these fundamental Active Directory issues, as an example, and all these other products and all these other standards, guidelines, policies, whatever, like just are missing this entire class of, basically, I go from plugging into the network to domain admin in less than an hour. Why aren't we fixing those things? And to me, the Mitre Attack framework and the surrounding tools behind it are helping close that gap.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Josh, that brings us
more like this is basically the leverage for organizations and defenders to be able to call BS on a vendor who claims that they can do something, and you can prove or disprove that that's actually true. You can actually validate assumptions that you've previously made. You can say, well, looking at what's possible inside of an environment, we know that shellcode injection does not work, or we know DLL injection does not work. We've tested these techniques, these different behaviors using benign payloads, and that is, this is the source of truth for both the blue team and the red team.
Right.
And so when we look at it like internally on the red team side, the data that you get from doing a purple team is basically the state of the organization or the customer at that point in time. And it's, sometimes, you have, different products and they can be configured differently. And so some of those are customer or configuration dependent. But oftentimes if you say, let's take create remote thread, for example, how many of the EDR products in the space would actually detect that as a behavior if run across all of them? This basically, fits into, you could build a matrix for all these different products and you could have all of that information, and that's super valuable if you're a red team. And so it's
and what's interesting, Josh, this could segue into a standardized way to test endpoint, I'll call it endpoint security products, right? Or security products in general against these techniques.
Yep, absolutely. And so Mitre Attack is actually already doing that.
They published some of that. Yep.
They're doing the evaluations for the different endpoint products. They're a nonprofit, and so there's no issue with that. And so it's definitely a valuable utility. And so hopefully, I sent this information over to them. Hopefully it'll make it a little bit easier for them to test different behaviors in a more comprehensive way.
That's fantastic.
Across the different methods of injection, because I think that for the endpoint is one of the most important. And so hopefully this utility fits into a lot of people's test harness. And so being able to get that data back, what's useful, what's not useful, what techniques have been, get detected by everything. And then, on the red team side, we can remove those, from the playbook.
And I guess, Josh, the next level of that is gaining support from Microsoft to make it more difficult to do some of these things, which, I mean, there's a lot of different techniques that we're talking about, right? But having Microsoft adopt support for basically taking out a lot of these techniques makes the attacker's job harder, makes the defender's job easier if inherently these things by design and maybe future designs or enhancements to the operating system just don't work anymore.
Right.
Yeah. So Microsoft has a difficult road with that in terms of the legacy side. They, in my opinion, they've been doing excellent work on the security side. Windows Defender, Windows ATP, and the AMSI, the anti-malware scripting interface, or scan interface. Sorry. It's really great stuff across the board, and it's making the attackers work that much harder. The issue is that they have legacy stuff that goes back so many years that it's supposed to work this way.
Yes.
What you were saying, where we're not actually exploiting vulnerabilities, we're using the system as it was designed
to execute code.
Itself.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. We're using the system against itself, and so it's supposed to work this way. And so they have to play the the game of being able to detect behaviors that are being executed. And I see it. It's obvious that they're definitely trying, and they're definitely doing good work in terms of pushing attackers to move from the traditional techniques towards more sophisticated. But it's a long way to go before all of these techniques just don't work out of the box on the operating system level.
So, Josh, I got a question, and it's about the tool and the methods, and it's maybe an obscure question, but what happened to method 900 and 1100 and so forth and so on?
Yeah, so some of the methods that I was originally writing and trying to get into the tool, they were not working fully when I did the release. And so I wasn't happy with them, and I removed them from the listing there.
Right, and no need to renumber. And that was what I figured, but that's one of those things when I see something that's unusual. And clearly 701 was one that you fit in somewhere that made sense to put there.
Yeah, at the time that was a decision that was made, but
decisions were made.
Yeah, why not 750? Never mind. For audio listeners, we're looking at Josh's screen output, and he's numbered all of the methods, and they jump around a little bit after the 600s, 700s. So,
I love the randomness or lack of randomness, or who cares? You just call the number what you call the number. Doesn't matter.
He created his own index.
It was sort
okay?
of like the hashcat approach to the methods.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
the method number doesn't really matter too much. It's just what is the technique that you're actually doing, and I could renumber them as just as easily, but
No, that's work.
For an initial release. It was just
I could see it. I could see the line of thinking if you were going for a category and you were like, well, I'll skip 100 so I can fill in others in the category. That sort of makes sense. But that maybe was not what you're going for. Who knows?
Doesn't matter. Regardless,
it doesn't. It's completely irrelevant.
But that said, that just means that Josh is sitting on code that he's going to make work and make this tool even better.
Well, the code is out there, and
or your pull request.
Contribute, so
or your pull request.
Do that.
Yeah.
Make it work. So.
Yes.
Anyways, so that's a little bit about the Vulkan injection tool. We have another code release that we also dropped. So maybe we shift gears and talk about that one.
Let's do it.
Excellent.
Do it.
So we chatted a little bit about Metasploit, and what we did was we recently put together our 1.0 release of our basically our Mitre Attack automation using Metasploit framework. And so with this, we basically added 3 new modules to our code base, and also put together a quick video demonstration for how to get it set up and running. And so for those who are familiar with Docker and using Metasploit in a Docker instance, we can go through that video. Let me just pull up. Here we go.
Yeah, I think Mark and Johnny have the video queued up.
Yep, that's right. That's right. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and play that, that'd be great.
Hey everyone, we're going to give a quick demo of getting the Praetorian's Purple Team Attack automation all set up and using that to run a couple of TTPs. So let's get started. We've got the documentation up here, a Kali VM with a secure password, and a Windows machine on the same VLAN. So let's get started. Because we're using Kali, we're going to use these instructions for getting Docker set up. So start copy pasting.
So we're using Kali because we figured that just doing the install would make it so much easier rather than having to just do the Metasploit side. If you didn't have that set up, it just makes it a little bit easier and quicker to basically get going.
Basically, you can build Kali using Docker images and build scripts today too.
Yep, 100%. So just to get the Metasploit side of that set up, it's super easy and quick to do. The video does walk you through all of that process for how to do this. Just make it a little bit easier.
And as we said,
access. Cool.
And as we said, Josh, Docker's the right way to wrap a custom Metasploit instance.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty good option because you don't have to worry about dependencies. So if you're running this inside of Kali or you're running this inside of anywhere you can run a Docker instance, you can run Metasploit, and that's super handy and useful.
Absolutely.
You don't have to fight the dependency war. Getting this stuff set up is a little bit of a difference from maybe your normal process if you haven't done it before, but just running any Docker container is relatively straightforward. So you do it once and you are off to the races. And
there's a lot of advantages to Docker versus VMs or virtual, like Python virtual environments. It's especially when you get to deployment specifically.
Python virtual environments kill me.
Yeah.
Yes. You're killing me, Smalls.
Just roll it into a Docker image, dude.
Yeah.
It's so much better, and there's so many great resources on how to do that more efficiently. I was reading some cool articles about how to take your Python Docker images from a couple of 100 meg all the way down to 100 or 200 meg to make them a little easier to work with and stuff. So. And cheaper to host in the cloud in terms of bandwidth and storage and all that stuff. But it requires a lot of research and education to get to that point, and some retraining of your brain.
Yeah.
Basically is what I presented at RSA, right? Is you got to retrain your brain as to how you think of environments and software, and the new, the fancy term for that is workloads, right? Is how you think of things today. But still, it does require
some retraining. For sure.
Yeah, some retraining and research and reconfiguration of your stuff.
Yep. So right now we're doing the Git clone, and that's github.com/Praetorian-code, and then the purple team attack. So if you just go to the Praetorian GitHub page, you'll see it listed there. And so at this point, we're just doing the Git clone, and then on the right-hand side of the video, he's actually generating the payloads. And in this case, he's just using a standard interpreter payload, and that's for the initial shell. Because the thought process when you're doing the purple team is when we were building out the Metasploit automation, we're building these out as post modules. And why are we doing that? Well, Meterpreter is an amazingly great rat, and so you can use the power of Metasploit and specifically Meterpreter to basically drive the systems to execute your specific TTPs on the endpoint. And so that's sort of how we sort of structured it. We're supporting both Windows, Mac, and Linux. And so on the Windows side, you'd use a Meterpreter payload. On the Mac or Linux side, you'd use a normal shell for that. There, but because the power of Meterpreter is super useful when you're talking about Windows automation for post exploitation. And so what he's doing now on the left-hand side of the screen for the Docker instance is setting up the handler and a configuration file for the listeners at this point.
Start the Docker service, and then build the container. And this can take a little while. If you're running on a VM, make sure you have enough RAM allocated to the VM. You'll get some weird errors during the build process if there's not enough RAM, and so spend a little while figuring all that stuff out.
So all this is taking a while.
Yeah, the first time you build the Docker image,
Okay,
you
assuming
build
the end of the
everything
container
from
build, because it took about 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, the first time you build the Docker image.
So now we should be able to start the container.
So while this process is sort of going, which is a little bit of setup and just getting the normal Meterpreter MSF console, we could also talk about the fact that there's the new Mitre Attack release. So they basically, on Tuesday of this week, was the April release. And the new major component to it was the addition of the impact tactic, which included a ton of different new TTPs. And that's something that we have not had yet in the past. And so I'll go through and I'll explain what that actually means. So they were looking at the availability or integrity of systems after an attacker had gotten into the environment and done something that had an impact to the business that was sort of left behind, or stopping a service or defacing a website, that sort of thing.
Excellent. So learning from actual issues that have happened.
Yeah, 100%. So if you go to the attack.mitre.org/resources/updates, which will be in the show notes, they have their April release, and you can see that on my screen at this point, which is a number of these different TTPs. There were 14 techniques underneath the impact tactic, which is new, and then there were a number of new techniques, some of which we contributed, such as compile after delivery, which is just using the Windows compiler, which is default and included on all modern versions of Windows, as well as some updates to existing techniques, such as things like valid accounts and PowerShell, which we were contributing back. Just pushing these updates, super important.
Excellent.
Okay, so shifting back to the video, so we have our he's just setting up the 64-bit version of the handler. But what we're going to do is once you have a session, and this should be familiar for everybody who's done any sort of pen testing with Metasploit, you have your sessions. And so what we've added, which is new, is the ability to, we're calling all of our modules, they're basically purple modules. So if you're going to run a TTP, it's going to be a specific module. And so the names are included in, basically correspond to the mapping inside of Mitre Attack. And so if you have a Mitre Attack TTP number that you're looking at demonstrating, you can just load the backend and just search for the specific number that you're interested in, and then it would come up inside of the interface. And so if you're in MSF console, you can just type search purple, and it will print out all the TTPs that we support. And then from there, you can search for the specific TTP that you're interested in demonstrating, select your session, and then you can just go to town and start executing it. Now, one of the things that you'll need to keep in mind as you're executing a specific TTP is many of these TTPs can be executed a number of different ways. So you might have 3 or 4 different ways for a specific TTP, and to get full coverage, you would need to test each one of those. And each of those could be demonstrated differently, and perhaps products might detect it or block it, and those would be different things to consider in terms of rating and delivery of those results. So just a few little nuggets there in terms of when you actually are in the field and using this stuff. Detection and prevention obviously are completely different. So this, we'll see the listing of the different TTPs. He's going to be doing the system time discovery. And so just executing that on the client, select your session, set your session to whatever your session is, execute it, and then you see the output there, which includes the timestamp and the output was successfully executed. Now, the next example that he's going to use here is something that actually does something that's more interesting than just printing information from the endpoint. So we're going to spawn the calculator, and we're going to do it using the install util TTP. So he's going to set this up, and by default, we're going to actually do the cleanup, and so we have to run it a second time to basically make sure that we're not doing the cleanup for us. In the video, we need to make sure that we set the architecture correctly, so he's gonna do that as well. The architecture needs to match what you're actually testing.
Josh, how long is this video?
This is another couple minutes.
Okay.
So if you just pause right there, you'll basically see that he's executing the calculator via the install util method. And from there, if you switch over to the, when he switches over, you'll see that it's going to be running, but the automation actually killed it for you. And so he needs to rerun the module.
And this video is on your YouTube channel as well?
That's correct, yeah. So if you go to the, if you go to the code base on GitHub, which I've sent over and should be included in the show notes, you'll be able to take a look at that and be able to reproduce everything that was done. That's the simple example. You see the calculators running right there. You'll see the code and the way that we got that running. So that was basically the demonstration of the Metasploit automation for you.
It's awesome.
So it just sort of fits really nicely in terms of anyone who's familiar with pen testing at all should be able to just sort of pick up this tool and start running it, start using it, start adding value, and start doing some really great Purple Team work.
Is this a tool that largely is in use by red teams, external red teams and internal blue teams, Josh? Or do you foresee this, some of them being used by the blue teams directly or internal red teams? Probably all of the above, I would imagine.
So it's, I mean, anyone who wants to do detection coverage assessment,
yeah,
this fits into that tool set. I think that a traditional red team is probably more focused on building out their own TTPs and their own capabilities, and doing so, depending on how you want it to structure it. This is definitely valuable for internal organizations who have a security team or offensive security team that wants to do this type of work. I would say that from a Purple Team side, anyone who's a pen tester should be able to pick up this tool and start running with it. This is definitely going to make organizations better. A lot of the services teams that do Purple Team or detection style testing,
mm-hmm.
It's going to fit right into whatever their process is for this type of work as well.
And
there
so
are
most
over 100 TTPs that we've included, so it's definitely should be a compelling case for all of them to start using it, given the fact that the coverage is pretty good and there are commercial tools in the space, but
sure,
it's this is the one that we would go with.
Larry, Joff, do you foresee yourselves using this on red team engagements, or is this something specifically where you're more closely working with the customer?
I think this is definitely more of the purple side.
Agreed.
But certainly,
I would agree with that.
But by looking at the tool from the purple side, you start to get ideas about
for the red side.
For the red side. So
like in your lab, you're running this stuff to be like, this technique works this way. Like now I can take this and roll my own custom module in whatever custom code that I built.
Shit, I had forgotten about TTP 1291.
Yeah.
Shit,
Let me
that's
try
right.
that.
I got to update my tool chain and
That's funny.
If you know that there's no detection in the environment for a specific TTP, that's super valuable for any red team to know.
Yep.
Right? That's one. The other is if there are 3 or 4 different ways to execute a TTP and your red team's only looking at or thinking about one way, then, diversifying your tool set is super important, right? That's super valuable for a red team. If you have a purple team and your purple team is basically the source of truth for the environment for detection coverage.
Yes.
At the end of the day, that's valuable for the red team to know and have that as a data point that feeds into the red team so they can make better decisions and be able to emulate and simulate actors. That's going to make your red team better.
Yep. And on the converse, on the purple team, that purple team is that knowledge that's the truth for what their detection looks like. And if you can deploy, if you can take one of those and deploy in different methods, helping them be able to detect those moving forward is amazing, which is why we have this.
Yep.
Now,
absolutely. And so,
question, and this may involve some discussion between Joff and Josh. Silent Trinity was one of the more recent kind of frameworks we covered for gaining execution in a red team environment. Are some of those techniques built into this, or what would that take? Obviously, maybe some offline discussion might be necessary to do that.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did when we were looking at the Mitre Attack TTPs that were already inside of Mitre Attack, that I believe is used in Silent Trinity, is the ability to use system management automation inside of PowerShell, which is basically what that means is the ability to call .NET capabilities within inside of PowerShell. And previously that was not inside of the PowerShell TTP. It was there, it just wasn't included in the write-up in the description. And so we contributed that back in the recent release. That's something that should be added and included and tested. And Silent Trinity is an example of how to do that in a particular way. So absolutely, I think that having the diversity to look at these TTPs, different tools are going to do them in different ways, and the integration of those into Mitre Attack, and also whatever your process is for detecting or validating that you're not able to detect certain activities is really important.
Yeah, and I would chime in, and I'd agree with that, actually. Anything that is able to exercise down to the .NET, dynamic runtime, the CLR, the DLR, I guess they call it, beyond and independent of language. I mean, PowerShell is just one example, is the way to go, right? Because there's going to be more and more of this diversity in attack mechanisms where people are just leveraging assemblies onto the system the best way they can get them there. And there's going to be no shortage of techniques that exploit that kind of avenue.
Yeah, 100%. The other TTP that was included in the release, which we contributed, was the ability to basically do compilation on the endpoint. And so if you have if you have C# code and you have a utility like the C# compiler, which is included on all systems, that's one way to get there. So that Mitre Attack does not include all TTPs that are possible. There's a delta there. And so ensuring that all, offensive-minded individuals in the community consider that and, contribute back. Because if there's a TTP or something specific, and they're not even, oftentimes they're not really even very exotic. And there's a simple example that comes to mind when you think about, network level reconnaissance. But, just thinking about what is not included and, how and what, should be included is definitely an important element when you think about red teaming, purple teaming, blue teaming. What are we not seeing in these frameworks that is possible? And making sure that you're always pushing the envelope to that next level.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talked about this yesterday, right? Like you can be safe, or you can be safe from Mitre Attack, and you're still not completely 100% safe ever, right? But when you're safe from Mitre Attack, you're only safe from what's defined in Mitre Attack. And when Josh is saying, like, there's other stuff out there that obviously is not covered, right? And what we don't want is people to get a false sense of security, to say, I've tested my environment extensively against Mitre Attack, therefore, like, I'm good, I'm really confident now. Like, no, like, don't gain that confidence, right? Like, yes, you've upped the bar significantly for an attacker. I think if you're testing effectively and implementing the remediation against everything, or as much as you can in the Mitre Attack framework, you're doing a great job, right? But don't have that confidence that means no one can break into our environment.
I'm going to play the role of Jeff here. So if you implement PCI DSS, whichever the latest standard is, you've significantly, you've raised the bar.
Right.
For what it is, but you're not invulnerable to everything.
Correct.
So.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I always draw it back to the analogy of an IDS filter that I saw years ago. And the IDS filter was for SQL injection. And the filter said, or 1 equals 1. If I see that string come across the network, then it is clearly bad. Well, what about or 2 equals 2?
Right? Or A equals A.
And so I think the analogy is there. You know, you've got to think of defenses in a systematic way that go beyond just the attack of the day. It's to use the cliche defense in death, it's more of the systematic architecture that is defensible in general, rather than just band-aids that you're patching on to deal with attack du jour. That's really the way to think about things. And you look at something like the Mitre Attack framework. I think the categorization is really well done, right? I mean, they're thinking ahead of the curve, but we are dealing with a moving target, right? Things are never going to stop, right? We're always going to continue to develop new techniques, good guys, bad guys, and the blue team's always going to be trying to get ahead of that as well. And so we're always going to have this continuing cycle going on. And I mean, that's sort of healthy in some ways, but it's a reminder not to be static.
Well, and you know what's interesting, Jeff, along those lines, and I started to touch on this yesterday, but I used to think that in almost all cases, if you were to do some of the basic hygiene, patching, configuration management, detection of, not just as a patch is missing, but how are these techniques that attackers are using executed on my network and on my systems, and be able to detect those, that you made the attacker's job harder in that the exploit techniques they would use would stand out more, that they would have to be more noisy, that they would have to do things that were more abnormal. And that may be the case. However, what you could also say today is that when you push attackers to those more advanced techniques, in some cases, that means they could be more stealthy if they're careful. You may not detect those extraneous cases. But now you've also, on the flip side of that, the positive is you've wiped out a whole class of attackers at a certain skill level or with a certain
That's what I was about to say.
Bingo.
Right, John? Yeah.
Bingo.
Right?
Right. I mean, the door swings both ways, right?
Yep,
Just like
exactly.
you said. But you've done, and I've worked with a lot of customers on this, like if you get that bar up high enough and you have eliminated a whole class of attackers that are using common off-the-shelf script kiddie stuff, you are in a better place.
Sure.
There's no doubt.
Yeah,
right?
agreed.
You're in a better place. You're making pen testers work harder. You're making attackers work harder. And if they really want to get it, then, they're going for much more targeted, much more crafted stuff. And then it's down to how high the fidelity of your controls are.
Yes.
Are you at a place where you're doing things like honey token and honeypot-like technologies where you are not just depending on the noisy false positive technologies, which we've historically seen are great for keeping the crappy shit at bay, but they're not really good for advanced attackers, right? You want that stuff to work, but you really want high fidelity on the advanced attacks so that those things really stand out when they occur.
The other thing that comes to mind is when you look at the Mitre Attack framework, you're going to have, here are the number of TTPs that are being released on a regular basis by Mitre. You have on the blue side, how many new TTPs are we detecting since the last Mitre Attack release? And then you have the APT, the most advanced adversaries, NSA, China, Russia, et cetera, that are, they're just developing new TTPs that are just, world class, and they're like the best offense in the world. So you have those three different levels. And if your blue side is not exceeding the number of TTPs that are coming out of Mitre Attack, then it seems like you're going to be at a lagging indicator.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
a good way to
with
put it.
that as a metric, if you need to detect and basically, if you expect to be fighting, nation state level actors, you need to be able to build your program such as your detection and response capabilities exceed the number of TTPs that are being released on a regular basis by Mitre Attack.
Yeah. Right. And as Joff said, you might be detecting the result of an advanced attack via a honey token or some other mechanism. Right. I mean, and again, Joff, I agree, it's kind of cliche, like defense in depth, which I think takes on multiple different meanings. But in this context, it's really about what are my other defensive measures, monitoring measures that I'm going to discover that something happened. It may be later in the stages of the attack,
right?
Sure, but hopefully there was some story that someone was in a major organization for like 6 months or something. I forget which one it was, but hopefully it's less than 6 months, for example.
I'd argue that would be sort of along the lines of a compensating control, where I know I can't detect this, but I can detect it once they've gotten here.
Yes, and here's what's really important, and
And I think a lot of these controls are trending towards data analytical approaches because of this, right? I mean, because people who defend their networks do have a gut feeling of when things are behaving from a macro sense in the correct way. If they've got enough instrumentation on their network and they are starting to see some things in terms of alert volume, in terms of specific events, in terms of traffic trends, they're going to start investigating further. And, that's important, right? Getting those controls in place really matter. You may not have super, super high fidelity on a specific attack, but you do have a data analytical sense that things are not right. And so you can go chase it down further and stop
with that. One of the things that when you take a TTP, whatever the TTP is, there are specific data sources that are required to be able to properly detect it. If you don't have the data sources, then from a data analytics perspective, you have nothing. So once you start getting the data, and then you can start tuning and tweaking it, and then working with the different operations teams to basically make sure that it's the right amount of noise. The signal noise ratio is correct.
I mean, a perfect example is, and again in this framework, right? I mean, if you see, again, for us, this is kind of run of the mill, but this could easily happen in an environment. If you see 5 workstations suddenly create a new service, and you have high fidelity on that service creation event, then you've got a serious problem, right? We know it because we know that's a direct indicator of lateral movement in a network, because it's an indicator of potentially a usage of PSExec or a similar type of technology where you're logging in, creating a service. So, it's those kinds of things that we need to get people to put higher fidelity on, and also to look at things like honey tokens and stuff. I mean, password spray is a classic example. I mean, I'm doing one tonight in an environment, right? If you had 20, 30 accounts that were honey tokens that were never supposed to be used in regular usage, and a password spray comes along, well, guess what? It's not good, right? Yes. If you get login events for those accounts. Right?
Hell, I'd argue if you get hundreds of attempted login attempts, failed login attempts, or thousands of failed login attempts, you should be able to detect that.
Well, you should, but in very, very large environments, I give people their due. There's a lot of pushback saying, look, we've got 100,000 people or we've got 200,000 people. Our volume of login attempts is already in the thousands.
Well, failed login attempts, I would argue that...
Failed, I would agree with you.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, because of course, if you have... You're likely going to have failed login attempts, thousands of them in fairly short periods of time, but that you should be able to detect.
So there's all kinds of things. I mean, it's what you're hearing bouncing back and forth. Is there are all kinds of things that people can do that should at least raise people's suspicion to go investigate further.
Sure.
I had a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
Go ahead, Lee. Sorry.
So it's okay. So the what's been going through my head is we've been talking about all the scenarios which are largely applicable to our traditional IT, and I'm wondering what happens to the conversation and the exercise when you talk about verifying capabilities with our cloud-based IaaS instead of on-prem. Are people even thinking about it? And can we?
Yes.
Do we have stuff to help?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that's actually one of the areas that Mitre Attack doesn't do so well on in terms of like cloud coverage, but that's absolutely one of the areas that we're pushing forward on and contributing back a number of different cloud-based TTPs. In terms of the coverage, what we've seen in the past, cloud is no real different than at its core. Having an environment in the cloud isn't really different from just a normal traditional corporate environment. It's just extended into another data center that is managed by another organization. With that, though, you have some unique components that are very specific to the cloud side, and then with that, you have the detection side, which is just fundamentally different.
It's interesting, and it even extrapolates further and gets kind of bucks from the traditional trend even more when we talk about serverless. And when you were talking about failed login attempts and trending that and looking at the data, when you go to a serverless environment where you're just basically executing functions, I did a briefing today with Aqua Security, and one of their problems they're trying to tackle is how do we do the same level of security in a serverless environment where you just really have code that's running. And one of the things we're looking at is baselining how often all of your functions are called. And if one is called 1,000 times, where normally it's just 20 times in a day, is a bad example, but you know what I'm getting at, right? And graphing that similar to what Signal Sciences does on the application side as well, and looking for those variances. Now we can start taking some of the monitoring that we're doing in logging and with user accounts, but apply that to applications as well. So I thought that was really, really exciting new features that are coming forth in that realm.
Yeah, so Lee, I think on the cloud side, it's an area that I know our team is definitely focused on, and I think that it's one that Mitre Attack is going to be addressing. I don't know if I'd say soon, but they definitely will address it at some point. It's definitely something that we're pushing on. So for sure.
Well, one of the things that got me thinking about cloud is I was looking at the changes to the attack frame, and I started because we're focusing on the impact stuff, and I'm thinking, how many people think about that as applies to when they're moving something to the cloud? I mean, not to get too simplistic, but I'm thinking there's a lot of areas that people aren't thinking about, and just getting them thinking, although we could probably go a lot farther when it comes to cloud, getting them thinking in the first place is a huge win.
Yep. So a lot of customers have already been asking about it. And so that's the feedback that we've been giving to Mitre, and we're working on formalizing and pushing forward a number of TTPs related to cloud.
Yeah.
Josh, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Yes.
Tonight.
Always a
So
pleasure.
much.
Nice to have you, my friend. Great discussion.
Happy to be on the show, and let me know. And you guys can find me on Twitter at Jabra, and I'll be looking forward to coming down sometime soon.
Absolutely. Check out the show notes, wiki.securityweekly.com, all things on Praetorian's blog for all of the links to all the resources that we talked about tonight. With that, we'll take a short break, come back with the security news for this week.